I'm Claire Donovan, and I've learned to wear silence like armor. At 34, I've built a tech startup from a tiny co-working space in Brooklyn into a product that just landed a multi-million-dollar acquisition offer. News I haven't even shared with my husband yet. Not because I'm secretive, but because our life revolves around performance, and timing is everything. And tonight, I was seated at a dining table that reeked of tradition, status, and curated cruelty. My husband's family's monthly formal dinner, a ritualistic gathering orchestrated by my mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitmore, a woman whose pearls seem surgically attached to her throat and whose opinions arrive laced with condescension, especially when directed at women who aren't, in her view, playing their role. It wasn't the first time I'd been scrutinized for daring to exist outside the parameters of domestic submission, but it would be the last time I sat quietly through it. The Whitmore estate sits in Westchester County like a manor out of a historical drama, marble columns, overly polished floors, and a dining room that can seat 20 while still managing to feel emotionally claustrophobic. I had chosen my outfit carefully. Tailored black trousers, a silk blouse in ivory, hair pulled back in a bun that whispered power rather than pleaded for approval. I already knew how tonight would unfold, subtle jabs hidden in small talk, judgment disguised as concern, and the eventual toast from Eleanor that always veered into some outdated thesis on gender roles. But I came anyway, because my husband Daniel, despite his progressive words and supportive gestures, still hasn't quite learned how to navigate the gravitational pull of his family's expectations, and because part of me, foolish or brave, wanted to see how far Eleanor would go this time. As expected, the conversation was weaponized from the appetizer course. "Claire, dear, are you still playing around with that little app of yours?" Eleanor asked with that saccharine smile she reserved for verbal gut punches. "Or have you considered teaching? You'd be so good with children." Around her, heads nodded in soft agreement, as if the suggestion was benevolent rather than a dismissal of everything I'd built. My pulse remained steady, my smile practiced. I'd learned long ago that battles with Eleanor weren't won by direct confrontation. They were won by survival and the careful placement of truths that detonated when least expected. I had the signed deal in my bag, still warm from the printer. Tonight was not about stooping to correct her. It was about making sure she would never underestimate me again. Dinner progressed with the usual hierarchy on display. Eleanor praising her other daughter-in-law for managing PTA duties, gushing over her son Andrew's new promotion at his father's firm, and complimenting her own roast as if she'd personally hunted the chicken. Daniel, seated beside me, squeezed my hand under the table during one particularly biting remark. It was his silent apology for the discomfort he couldn't prevent, for the loyalty he still held to a family dynamic he hadn't yet fully rejected. I didn't blame him, not entirely. We are all raised inside myths that take time to dismantle. Mine was that success would be enough. His was that Eleanor's love could be earned by behaving correctly. Both myths were about to unravel. Then came the toast. Eleanor stood, glass in hand, her pearls gleaming like a noose of heritage. "To women," she began with theatrical warmth, "who know their place in the world, who create homes, raise children, and don't chase wild ambitions that leave everyone else hungry for their attention." A beat of silence followed, charged with subtext so thick it could have been sliced with the dessert knives we hadn't yet used. Several heads turned subtly in my direction. Even the help seemed to freeze in the act of pouring wine. Daniel shifted in his seat, eyes flicking toward me, but he said nothing. My chest rose, then stilled. I heard the pulse in my ears louder than the clinking of crystal. I rose slowly, deliberately. My glass remained on the table. "Eleanor," I said, my voice calm, "thank you for that clarifying toast." I reached for my handbag with practiced ease, drew out the envelope, and placed it on the table beside my untouched wine. Before dessert is served, I thought I'd share something too. My place in the world, as defined by the board of Acuratech and the legal counsel of Whitman and Cole. Eleanor's smile faltered. The room leaned toward me, metaphorically if not physically. As of this afternoon, my startup was acquired for $42 million fully executed. The app you called a hobby just bought me this roast and every future dinner you might think I need an invitation to attend. The silence was exquisite, like the breathless hush before a symphony's crescendo. And I, finally, was done asking for space. The silence after my announcement didn't dissolve so much as calcify, turning the air into something dense and brittle, as if any sudden movement might cause the whole room to shatter. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she lowered her glass, the liquid inside catching the light in a way that almost mocked her. Her eyes scanned the envelope I had laid down like a detonator, as if unsure whether opening it would confirm the threat or diffuse it. Around the table, the posture of guests shifted, from bored politeness to stunned curiosity, and in some cases, poorly concealed discomfort. I remained standing, not out of defiance, but necessity. I wasn't done being seen. Not the version of me they thought they knew, the quiet, obliging wife, but the version that had bled for her vision in late-night coding marathons, that had pitched to hostile investors, and that had bootstrapped a company from the ashes of her first failed prototype. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice a whisper that only I could hear. "Claire, you didn't tell me." His face wasn't angry, just stunned, like someone watching a house burn down and realizing they'd lived in it without ever noticing the smell of smoke. I looked at him, not with apology, but with a tenderness edged in steel. "I wanted to tell you when it was real, and tonight, more than ever, I needed it to be undeniable." He nodded once, slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. He knew what this dinner had cost me emotionally, year after year. How many times I'd bitten my tongue until it bled. How many small slights I'd endured under the guise of politeness. And now, the tables had quite literally turned. I could feel the shift in the room, the uncomfortable awakening of people who had built their opinions on illusions. Eleanor's voice finally came, thin but sharp. "I see." 2 words, laced with centuries of entitlement and a lifetime of controlling every narrative in her orbit. "Well, Claire, that's unexpected." Her emphasis on the last word was surgical, an attempt to reassert control by reframing my triumph as a deviation, a fluke. Success, of course, can come in many forms. Her tone turned syrupy, a pivot into civility that barely masked her simmering fury. "But I do hope this windfall doesn't distract you from what truly matters. Family, responsibility, stability." She glanced toward the portrait on the wall behind me, her late husband in oil paint, a reminder of what she considered legacy. It was both a threat and a dismissal, her last attempt to fold me back into the mold. But I had outgrown it. I looked her in the eye and smiled. "Legacy looks different to different people, Eleanor. Mine is just beginning." Later, in the powder room mirror, I stared at my reflection and felt the tremor hit, not from fear, but from the magnitude of finally taking up space. I had imagined this confrontation countless times, each fantasy ending in a dramatic exit or public meltdown. But reality had been quieter, more surgical. And the reaction from the room wasn't applause, it was disorientation. People didn't know how to categorize me now. I no longer fit into the family's hierarchy of predictable roles. I had rewritten the script without permission. That power unsettled them. And if I was honest, it unsettled me too. Because stepping out of invisibility meant exposing everything. My ambition, my anger, my refusal to shrink. I wasn't just asserting success. I was burning the house of lies brick by brick. On our way home, the car ride was thick with unspoken words. Daniel drove in silence, his grip on the wheel firm but not tense. I could feel him processing, not just the acquisition, but everything it implied. "You really didn't want to tell me until tonight?" he asked finally, eyes still on the road. I hesitated, then answered truthfully. I didn't want to celebrate it in a vacuum. I wanted to reclaim something. Every dinner like this, I've left feeling like I was being slowly erased. I needed this to be loud. He exhaled, and for the first time I saw admiration unfurl in his posture. "You were never erased, Claire, but I see now that you were being silenced, and I let it happen." His honesty stung, but it also healed, because that was the beginning of something we hadn't yet had: clarity. Back in our apartment, I finally exhaled. The city lights through the window felt like a mirror of possibility. I opened my laptop and stared at the inbox with the finalized acquisition documents. My name in the signature line, alongside the CFO's, felt surreal. Not because I doubted I deserved it, but because for the first time, the validation was external and unignorable. My success was no longer a private victory. It was now part of the public narrative. Yet I knew that this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a reckoning, with Eleanor, with Daniel, with myself. The real story wasn't about a startup sold or a toast interrupted. It was about a woman who had been underestimated for so long. She had learned to weaponize silence, and now had chosen to break it. Long before I stood in Eleanor's dining room with a multi-million-dollar acquisition in my handbag, I was just the girlfriend Daniel brought home one Thanksgiving, wearing a thrifted wool coat and shoes that still bore the salt lines of a brutal Brooklyn winter. That first dinner was my introduction to Eleanor's version of hospitality: effusive praise for other women at the table, strategic silence whenever I spoke, and a faint curl of her lip every time I reached for my water glass with my left hand, revealing the small scar I'd gotten from soldering an early prototype of the wearable sensor that would one day become our company's cornerstone. She never asked what I did. not once. But when dessert was served, she leaned in just close enough to murmur, "You have clever eyes, Claire. I hope you don't waste them chasing impossible things." That moment branded itself into my memory, not because it hurt, but because it clarified exactly who I was dealing with. A woman who measured worth by tradition and saw ambition in a daughter-in-law as an act of rebellion. Daniel didn't understand it at first. He thought Eleanor was just old-fashioned or guarded, but he didn't see the way her compliments for other women were always tinged with ownership, congratulating them for supporting their husbands' careers, for staying home where real impact happens, for organizing charity auctions instead of profit-driven companies. He didn't hear the knife in her compliments or notice how she always offered advice disguised as concern. "Startups are so unstable," she once said after overhearing me discuss funding with a friend on the phone. "Do you ever worry about being left with nothing?" I told her I'd rather build something from nothing than inherit something I didn't believe in. She smiled, like I was a child telling a bedtime story. And in that smile, I saw the same thing every time: dismissal coded in civility. I began to track her language like a data set, measuring the frequency of her interruptions, the pauses she inserted when I entered a conversation. It became my private game, the sociology of erasure. I started building my company in the hours between obligations. I would leave these family events with a tension headache and an idea for a new UI improvement, fueled by the indignity of being underestimated. My co-founder Maya used to joke that Eleanor was our unofficial chief motivator. "Every time she opens her mouth, our valuation goes up," she'd say, laughing. And maybe she was right. I wasn't just working to succeed. I was working to survive the suffocating pressure of being acceptable. The early investors were skeptical at first, 2 women pitching a niche health tech tool in a saturated market. But we knew our data, we refined the tech, we ran lean, and we pivoted hard when the market demanded it. For every closed door, we built a side entrance. Eleanor never saw any of it. Not because I hid it, but because she never looked. To her, I was always the distraction in Daniel's life, not the engine of my own. Ironically, it was her constant questioning that helped me sharpen my pitch. At family dinners, I learned to speak in the tight, confident tones of someone who's always 2 sentences away from being interrupted. At business meetings, that skill translated into control. While other founders scrambled to be heard, I had been trained in the crucible of domestic microaggressions. And yet, I never let bitterness drive me. My success wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. I refused to let her define the ceiling of my life, but that didn't mean I wasn't aware of the cost. There were nights I came home from these dinners and cried in the shower, the water masking the grief of still being treated like a guest in my own marriage. Because while Daniel loved me, he had never once publicly corrected his mother's tone. Not until the night of the toast. That evening was more than just a breaking point. It was a culmination. The years of nodding, of smiling through the snubs, of choosing silence for the sake of peace. I had become fluent in the language of suppression, but fluency is not the same as comfort. When I laid that envelope on the table, it wasn't just the acquisition document. It was every muted moment I'd swallowed, every time I'd told myself it wasn't worth the fight. It was the receipt of my endurance, and it had consequences. The next morning, Daniel received an email from his father, brief, cold, and unmistakably orchestrated by Eleanor. "We are disappointed by the tone and public nature of last night's conversation. Perhaps it's time for some space." A warning cloaked in aristocratic concern. Daniel read it in silence, then quietly deleted it without comment, and for the first time, I saw him choose me. The following week, I was invited to speak at a conference in Austin. Headline panel, spotlight session. Maya stood beside me backstage and whispered, "You ready to be seen for real this time?" And I realized that was the most terrifying and beautiful part of everything. I no longer had to hide. Not my intellect, not my ambition, not the uncomfortable truth that I had outgrown a family that never truly welcomed me. As I walked onto that stage, the spotlight hit like a warmth I hadn't expected. And I thought, maybe Eleanor was right about one thing: clever eyes should never be wasted, especially not on people who are too afraid to look directly into them. The story spread faster than I anticipated, not because I shared it, but because someone else did. 3 days after the dinner, a distant cousin with a tech blog posted a cryptic tweet. "When your cousin-in-law drops a 42mm mic at Sunday roast." Legendary. No names, no details, but enough breadcrumbs for people to start digging. By Friday, a local business column picked up the acquisition news and added a speculative angle. "Whitmore family daughter-in-law stuns society circle with surprise exit deal." Suddenly, the same people who once dismissed my startup as a side hobby were name-dropping it at networking events, claiming to have always believed in my vision. Eleanor remained silent, at least publicly. But I knew her well enough to recognize the orchestration behind certain whispers. Acquaintances calling Daniel to ask if we were doing okay, family friends reaching out with offers to help Claire adjust to her new wealth. Help. As if success was a burden I wasn't built to carry. Daniel, to his credit, held the line. He began excusing us from family events with polite firmness, drawing boundaries with the quiet clarity of someone who had finally seen the cost of inaction. Our relationship shifted too. Not explosively, but tectonically. We talked more, argued more, exposed wounds we'd both learned to ignore. One night, over takeout and wine, he asked, "Did you ever think about walking away?" I didn't lie. Yes, but not from you, from the version of us where I had to shrink to fit. He sat with that answer, then reached across the table and held my hand like it was something fragile and holy. I want to build a version of us where you don't have to shrink. Ever again. It wasn't a solution, but it was a vow. And for the first time, it felt real. Professionally, everything accelerated. Media outlets wanted interviews. Investors I'd once pitched to now reached out with apologies disguised as congratulations. I hired a small team to help structure my next move, a mentorship initiative for women founders navigating hostile industries. Maya and I called it Found HR, equal parts resource and rebellion. Every woman who had ever sat silently at a table where she wasn't welcome found a place at ours. And still, every success echoed back to that dinner, to the moment I claimed space in a room designed to erase me. That night had become a myth in itself, recounted at cocktail parties and founder circles. People loved the narrative. Underestimated woman shuts down aristocratic matriarch with a contract, but the truth was far less cinematic. It wasn't about a takedown. It was about survival. Visibility for women like me is never just about ego. It's about breath. Eleanor, true to form, began her counteroffensive subtly. She sent Daniel a family heirloom, an antique watch with a handwritten note, for time better spent. A barb disguised as sentiment. When that failed to provoke a response, she escalated. A family attorney called about redistributing trust shares to protect family legacy. Daniel declined the meeting. She then invited us to a charity gala. Front row seats, photo ops guaranteed. I declined, and so did he. Each refusal felt like pulling a brick from a crumbling facade. Eventually, her silence returned, but this time it felt like retreat, not superiority. And that, more than any toast or insult, was the clearest sign that something had truly shifted. Meanwhile, I started therapy. Not because of Eleanor, but because of the invisible weight I still carried. Years of being treated as an accessory, of fearing that love required compliance, of conflating humility with invisibility. My therapist, a sharp woman named Nadine, asked in our second session, "Who would you be if no one else was watching?" The question rattled me. For so long, my identity had been forged in opposition, in rebellion against diminishment. But who was Claire without the need to prove? I didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time I was ready to find out. Not through success, but through peace. On a rainy Thursday in October, I walked past the Whitmore estate on my way to a nearby event. The gates were open, and for a moment I considered stopping, just to see if the roses were still in bloom. But I didn't. Instead, I kept walking, the click of my heels echoing on the wet pavement, a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. I no longer needed to be seen by those who refused to truly look. And in that realization, I found something deeper than victory. Freedom. Not from Eleanor. From the version of myself that once needed her approval to feel whole. 6 months after the dinner that changed everything, I stood on the stage of the annual Women in Tech Summit, delivering a keynote not about profit margins or exit valuations, but about silence, how it hardens, how it suffocates, how it tricks you into believing that survival is enough. Behind me, the Found HR logo glowed on the screen, flanked by the names of our first cohort of funded founders. I had worn the same blazer from that dinner, crisp, ivory, tailored like armor. Not as a statement, but as a reminder. That night had been the crucible, but tonight was the coronation. And I didn't need Eleanor or anyone to clap for it to matter, because I had finally stopped measuring myself in echoes. Now I spoke in my own voice. Daniel sat in the front row, next to Maya, who was already planning our second fund cycle. When the speech ended, he met me backstage, wrapped me in an embrace that said everything his words never could. "You've never looked more yourself," he said, and he was right. Not more powerful, not more successful, just more me. We had grown in that silence after the storm. We still argued, we still unraveled sometimes, but the difference now was that I no longer negotiated my worth in those moments. I was no longer afraid to be large in a marriage that once required me to be small, and Daniel no longer confused harmony with my silence. We were rewriting, together. The Whitmores faded from our daily lives like furniture covered in sheets, still there, but no longer functional. Eleanor had made no direct contact since the trust conversation, but a few weeks after the summit, I received a letter. Handwritten, not an apology, not quite. It read, "I underestimated what strength looks like in women not shaped by my mold. I can't say I understand your world, Claire, but I see now that you never needed my permission. You needed space. I won't stand in the way of that anymore." I reread it several times, searching for subtext, for poison behind the ink, but there was none. Just an old woman admitting the limits of her worldview, too late to change history, but maybe not too late to step aside. I didn't respond, not out of anger, but because I no longer owed her a reply. Some chapters are closed not with vengeance, but with peace. I did, however, keep the letter, folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer beside the acquisition documents and the original prototype of the wearable sensor that started it all. Artifacts of a life rebuilt from doubt, from dismissal, from invisibility. Proof not of revenge, but of evolution. I had not inherited wealth. I had inherited narrative, and now I chose what story to tell. On a quiet morning in December, I stood in front of the mirror and saw someone I would have envied a year ago, not because of her clothes or accomplishments, but because of the stillness in her eyes. The woman staring back no longer looked for permission to speak, to shine, to lead. She looked like someone who had forgiven the people who couldn't love her as she was, and had stopped trying to make them. She looked like someone who had built a new lineage not of blood, but of belief, of chosen sisters, of women whose worth no longer needed defending. And maybe that's what real power is, not the mic drop moments or the million-dollar headlines, but the quiet reclamation of a self that was never truly lost, just hidden, waiting for the moment it no longer had to ask to exist. My story began at a dinner table built for erasure, but it ends here, in my own voice, at my own table, surrounded by women who were once told they were too much or not enough, and who finally know they've always been exactly what the world needed. We are not the exceptions. We are the inheritance.